We have a minute or so before we'll get started on today's workshop, but I will continue letting people in as they are arriving in the waiting room.
Oh, Terry Zines on the call. Hi, Terry.
Yeah, feel free to turn on your microphone and say hi while we're waiting for everybody to get on before the presentation start.
Well, you're not obviously in the office, Angie.
No, well, I am. This is my office nowadays. It's, you know, I'm out in the field.
Hi, Meister, how are you?
Hey, Matt.
Well, if you notice the background, Angie, I
Yeah.
finally got my camera and speakers and my computer up in my upstairs office to function. So this is my real world.
Yeah, I've had a couple of times I'm in meetings and people are like, is that a virtual background? And I'm like, nope, nope, it's the real outdoors. I'm just in it. Once I discovered that my Wi-Fi reached into the backyard, that changed everything. Then there's no reason to sit at the dining room table all day long anymore. Okay, well, it is 2:01. I will go ahead and in the background continue admitting people as they are logging on. But in the interest of everybody's time, we may as well go ahead and get started on our final workshop in the three-part series of St. Croix virtual workshops on the water. And today our two speakers, Matt Bauman from the Minnesota DNR and Kay Lutze from the Wisconsin DNR, are going to be talking specifically about the Lower St. Croix Riverway, special rules regarding the Riverway, sticky issues, key topics, high water, all sorts of good stuff that I know people will be interested in. We are recording the presentation today, and just like with the last two, I'll send out a link to that recording afterwards and a PDF of the slides. So you can share that with other people from your organization if they weren't able to participate today. And go ahead and type questions into the chat feature, and I will try to keep track of those during the presentations. And if we have time, we can let people turn on their microphones later on to ask questions in person. I think we'll go a little bit later than 3 o'clock, so if you're able to stay on, please do so. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn things over to Matt and Kay. Thanks.
Thanks, Angie. And I'm Matt Bauman. I'm with the Minnesota DNR. For those of you that didn't join 2 weeks ago, I work at a central office in St. Paul as the program lead for the Lower St. Croix Land Use Program. And I haven't been in this specific role for all that long, but I'm very familiar with the River Valley. I lived in Lakeland for a period when I relocated to the cities, and I've explored it up and down on land and water. The river's a gem, and I think that everybody that lives along the river feels the same way. Anyway, I work primarily in a supportive role to our area hydrologists, who serve as the primary community contact for all of the communities along the riverway. Craig Wills is the primary community contact, our area hydrologist for Chisago County. He's been there for quite some time. And the area hydrologist for Washington County for the past year, like 6 years, had been Jen Sorensen, and that's just recently shifted over to Jason Spiegel. The majority of this presentation are my slides with focus on the Minnesota side of the river. And Kay Lutze was a late add, and we've asked her to jump in on this presentation to highlight some of the differences on the Wisconsin side for attendees that may be from the other side of the river. Kay, I know that you don't have video, but do you want to take a second and introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Matt and Angie, for letting me tag along today. Appreciate the invite. So I will tell everybody that I actually started my career as a zoning administrator about 25 years ago for Door County. Prior to that, I did work for the department for about 9 years as an LTE, and then finished up my master's and became what I would say is a shoreland zoning administrator for, gosh, what do we have? About 220 miles of coastal shoreline. So very familiar with coastal issues. I came back to the department about 6 years ago as the shoreline policy coordinator, and we provide policy oversight and technical guidance to the counties and the municipalities who regulate shoreline zoning and then shoreline wetland zoning, and then of course the lower St. Croix Riverway. So that's my role, and then also took on a basin supervisor role about 2 years ago as well.
Thanks, Kay. Yeah, I can sympathize with your position, because the St. Croix is just one program that we administer, and there are quite a few other land use programs out there, and they all have different standards. And you know, I like Kay, I used to work at the local level too, and I can sympathize with any local administrator that is tasked with administering a very complex program like this one. And I've learned quite a bit by pulling Kay into this presentation, and you know, I'm hoping everybody else can glean something, you know, seeing the differences on both sides of the river. The intended audience for this presentation is local officials. So for the average person that's not all that familiar with the zoning standards, some of it may be higher level than maybe a one-on-one course. But I think that everybody should be able to get something out of it. But it's those local officials who are responsible for administering the land use ordinances. So the DNR, Wisconsin and Minnesota, doesn't have any permitting authority for activities above the water's edge. We may comment on or challenge a decision from time to time, but our authority to do so is really no different than any other concerned citizen. So like Angie said, we'll probably go a little long, and we'll leave the webinar open after we're through to accommodate for individual questions as they come up. So the Federal Wild and Scenic Rivers Program, it started with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in 1968. The St. Croix and the Namakagon down to Taylor's Falls were among the first 8 rivers designated. 4 years later, in 1972, the lower St. Croix Riverway was added and federally designated due to its outstandingly remarkable scenic, recreational, and geologic values. So they recognize that to keep the area in pristine and a natural state, protections couldn't come exclusively from the federal purchase of lands or scenic easements, which is really the best method of protection, and the primary method of protection for the upper portion of the riverway, but instead had to come from adoption and enforcement of land use regulations. I mean, there's only so much money to go around. So they formed a cooperative agreement, which was made, and that drove the creation of a master plan. And that master plan basically formed a rough ideal of what the state rules would say, guidelines for water surface uses, wake rules and whatnot, land uses, crossings, and some other stuff. But the states then adopted their rules independently of one another. So the state rules are slightly different, but the basis for them is the same. They're both created based on those original recommendations of the master plan. So when the riverway was first designated, it was acknowledged that the best method was outright purchase. And the upper 27 miles, basically everything north of Stillwater, is the area where National Park Service concentrated their acquisitions. A handful of lands, mostly islands, were purchased outright. Interstate State Park came from land that had previously belonged to the power company. And then other lands were prioritized for the purchase of scenic easements, where the park district or the Park Service basically purchased development rights from lands that were visible from the river. And the easements were mainly in those unincorporated areas that were visible. All other protections came in the form of, zoning, land use regulations. The purpose statement here came from the original master plan to preserve the existing scenic and recreational resources of the lower St. Croix River through controlled development. And, they recognized that development was going to happen, just how to accommodate for it in a way that is sustainable. Okay. In Minnesota, along the Riverway, we have 14 local governments that have zoning authority. 12 of those 14 are in Washington County. So we recognize that for most of these communities, there's challenges in administering these regulations. Most of these are very small communities that do not have a full-time planner or zoning administrator. Regardless, these communities are still responsible for their own ordinance that are on their books. Before this presentation, I did a brief inventory and perused local websites, and I found 12 of those 14 ordinances online. Of those 12, 5 mirror or closely resemble what Washington County's ordinance is. 3 are clearly unique. 3 communities have adopted Washington County's ordinance by reference. One community has adopted the state rules by reference. Now, all of those methods are legal ordinances and effective ordinances. So, that's important because it's, recognizing that 8 of those 14 communities, at least in Minnesota, are enforcing some variation of the same ordinance, Washington County's. And it should be noted that there are some inconsistencies between the Washington County ordinance and those that are in rule. And some provisions are more restrictive. In fact, there's some great provisions that are more restrictive, and then some are less. And that's just the way it is. That's the reality. Chisago County's ordinance actually appears to more closely mirror what's in rule. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll speak about the regulations as they're written in rule. And then as we go on, I'll get into ways in which communities can improve the standards that are on their books. But for our purposes, it's just important to recognize that the effective controls are that in local ordinance. The key standards in the Riverway, while there's water quality components to these standards, the regulations are mostly designed to maintain those that scenic and natural character. I'll touch on these individually as we go on to the presentation, but the big ones are districts, which determine the intensity of development that's allowed. And by enforcing through district, this allows greater density where it can accommodate it, mostly within city limits. And there's dimensional standards that to some extent do vary with district, but those dimensional standards are lot size, lot width, setbacks from the water's edge, from bluff lines, the tops of bluffs. There's height standards, there's impervious surface limitations per lot. It regulates land uses, and with the exception of urban areas and the occasional marina, land uses in the Riverway are largely single-family homes, and that's by design. Color of structures, that's a unique one to the Riverway. requires the use of earth tone colors. And then a big one, a challenging one, is limitations on vegetation cutting and land alterations. There are two districts in the Riverway, at least on the Minnesota side, rural and urban. And these districts influence lot size, lot width, and setbacks. Urban districts are broken down by sewered and unsewered. To the best of my knowledge, I think Stillwater, Oak Park Heights, and Bayport are the only sewered cities on the Minnesota side. But these are almost completely developed. So there's few opportunities for more subdivisions than that, which have already been created. So if you look at the cities that are mentioned on the slide, you won't see Scandia, and that's because it was newly incorporated since the rules were adopted. So it's treated as rural since that used to be Washington County. And then so we're in the process of creating a map which details the boundary. In fact, it's done. It just hasn't been officially released. And as well as districts. So that data set will be available in the next week or two for GIS users. And we hope to eventually roll that out into an online mapper when we're able and have the manpower to do that. So what you see on your screen here came from the St. Croix River Association, who created a lot of really good resources for local officials and landowners as well. A lot of the local officials were pulled in during the development of these. And the images on the right detail the setback standards. On the left side of the river, you have rural areas, and on the right side of the river is urban areas. You have setbacks from the water's edge on the top, setbacks from bluff lines on the bottom. The table on the left goes into a little bit more detail with some of the other dimensional standards. We have standards for lot size and lot width, building setback from the ordinary high water level, and setback from the bluff. Then the bottom two rows, really across the board throughout all districts. The Riverway is a 35-foot height standard. That's specific to the Minnesota side, as well as a 20% limit for impervious surface coverage on any given lot. And the next slide is Kay's, who is going to detail some of those differences on the Wisconsin side.
Yeah, so just, what Matt and I had originally talked about was it was interesting some of the comparisons from each side of the river. So on the Wisconsin side, we actually have 5 management zones: Rivertown, small town historic, rural residential, and conservation. So they determine lot size by ordinance for the first 3. There's a minimum lot width determined by ordinance. And then there's ordinary high watermark setbacks, bluff setbacks, and maximum heights that are detailed by each of these zones. And as Matt talked a little bit about use, these management zones also determine what uses are allowed across the board. And then specifically, there are also some additional conditional uses that can be identified by ordinance within the Rivertown, small town, and small town historic by ordinance, as long as they preserve really the natural and scenic qualities of the riverway, and they protect the public health and safety, and of course prevent erosion and water pollution. We do have, a couple of counties out there who have some more restrictive regulations within their ordinance. So one thing I thought was interesting in is Polk County, I think, has a 25-foot height limit across the board. So that's another example of how an ordinance can be more protective or more restrictive. And I do believe that their ordinance has a 200-foot ordinary high water mark setback as well. So just kind of a little bit of a difference in the two areas, and really like zoning district, or what we would call management zones.
Okay. Thanks, Kay. And we'll have a few more case slides peppered in here. The next standard I'll get into, and I don't know to what extent this applies, but the rules accommodate for clustering of subdivisions. And since most of the urban areas of the Riverway are fully subdivided, this largely applies to rural districts, Washington County mostly. And with this type of design, the rule actually allows up to 50% more units if those units are clustered together with some shared open space. And Washington County actually enforces a higher standard here, and instead chooses to preserve that rural character in the Riverway a little bit more. They allow clustering, but don't accommodate for that increased allowable density. They want to keep their rural areas rural. Uses, by and large, the Riverway, I mean, basically it's like 90% single family housing. There's opportunities for, you know, basic accessory uses. I mean, parking, home-based businesses are some accessory uses, but accessory uses would also include accessory structures like a shed or even a pool. But those accessory structures would still have to meet the same setback requirements that any other primary structure does as well. Commercial uses are allowed, but largely limited to urban areas with a few exceptions. Marinas are included here, but there's also special standards for marinas too.
Hey, Matt, I'm
yeah.
getting a couple of questions on what slide. Everybody is still seeing the summary of Wisconsin standards slide. Is that the slide you're talking from right now?
Oh my, okay. Okay, so
There
here's your standard cluster subdivision.
Awesome.
And you can see on the right, you know, we got residences clustered around shared open space. And then moving on. Uses. I'm just getting into uses, just getting through uses now. But the slide introduces what uses are permitted and what uses are prohibited. You know, your more intensive uses are prohibited. The rules explicitly prohibit multifamily residential uses as well. So I'll stay on this slide a little bit more while you guys catch up. And I think the next slide is Kay's.
So Matt, there was a question earlier about the difference between state rules and local ordinances. When you were listing just now those prohibited uses, is that prohibited by state rule or by a local ordinance?
Those are prohibited by state rule.
Okay.
And a local ordinance is always encouraged, or a local community is always encouraged to enforce a more restrictive standard if they choose to do so.
Here's another question. There's a marina in St. Croix. How is that accommodated?
Most marinas are grandfathered, and there's certain provisions on expansions, and the details of which I guess I would have to reference rule. But you know, everything that had existed prior to the regulations going in place are still grandfathered. I think most of our marinas existed before 1974. So, okay, I think this next slide is you.
Okay. So I will pretty much mimic what Matt said with regard to uses. Our rules are in code as well. We refer to them as NR 118, and the local communities are the ones responsible for the implementation and the administration and enforcement of the ordinances. And NR 118 identifies permitted uses and structures in all management zones, as well as conditional uses that are allowed in all management zones. And really, it's single family residential and accessory structures. So that's going to be the main really permitted use on these properties. Appears if there's a permit, some erosion control, and then conditional uses is how the process is used with regard to land divisions, the planned cluster developments, and some gradings. The stairways and lifts, those are also conditional use permits. So if something has not been identified within the ordinance as permitted or conditional, then that structure or use is just prohibited.
Okay, thanks, Kay. Next, we'll move on to color, structure color. I guess if you're one that wants to paint your house neon yellow, you might be out of luck because we have in the rules restrictions on the color that your house is to be painted. And color isn't something that most zoning administrators are used to regulating. And interpreting the meaning of earth tone has been a challenge since that term was adopted in rule. It is mentioned, the St. Croix River Association has been very proactive, and they put out a lot of really good resources. And one of those was development of color swatches. So they came out with basically a color palette of mutually acceptable colors, and they had a public input process for that. And development of that has taken a lot of the guesswork out of it. So I'll shift over to higher standards, and I'm still touching on specific standards, but I'm going to pepper in a few slides related to higher standards and what communities can do to improve the ordinance that they have on their books. The statewide rules are minimum standards, and it's also very clear in the rules that communities are free to adopt more protective standards as well. And the rules aren't perfect, and in fact there's many issues that could be clear in an ordinance or would benefit from the adoption of some kind of higher standard, and there's a variety of examples that I'll share, but I'll share a handful of those standards where rule language probably could be strengthened a little bit, and it's probably easiest just to do it through ordinance updating. And we've been in discussion internally to roll out some further recommended guidance related to higher standards. And I guess I'm willing to work proactively with any local communities that want to improve upon their ordinance language. And eventually I'm hoping to develop a model ordinance, but expect development of a model would require a fair amount of collaboration with each of the communities along the Riverway. Now there's quite a few reasons why a community would want to adopt more protective standards, but all the issues listed here, those 5 at the bottom of the screen, runoff, erosion, water quality, habitat loss, these are all exacerbated by climate change. And I mean, you've probably heard it's getting warmer. And average temperatures have increased by nearly 3 degrees in the last century. And warm air holds more moisture, and there's some variability in the moisture changes, and that especially holds true for our area. Where it's very well documented that we're getting more rain. More like big rain events, especially our intense rain events, 6 inches. Rain events of 6 inches are 4 times more frequent than the previous 3 decades. And the 10 warmest and wettest years have all occurred in the past 20 years. So we're getting more rain in greater intensity, and this will lead to more high water issues and more erosion. And you know, these temperature changes are also going to weaken the ability of native plant communities to defend themselves against invasives. So we're kind of in a transition period, and it's something to be aware of. And you know, it's an opportunity to build a more resilient landscape. And we all have a tendency to think that this is a global issue that we can't do anything about, but you know, building a more resilient landscape is one way in which we can help. And a big way to do that is through vegetation standards. On the Minnesota side of the Riverway, a permit is required for cutting within 200 feet of the water in rural areas, rural districts, or 100 feet from the water in urban districts, or on any bluffs or areas within 40 feet of bluffs. And in those areas, for the most part, cutting's restricted to trees that are less than 6 inches in diameter, or diseased trees and shrubs. Any cutting activities must maintain the natural character, which would include removal of vegetation that's screening a structure. So there's nothing in rule that allows for clearing to accommodate a view. That's a key difference with the Riverway standards versus the shoreline standards, because everybody wants a view. And 2 weeks ago, my presentation was heavily focused on vegetation standards and the challenges with enforcing them. Now, these standards in the Riverway were written 50 years ago, and we've learned a lot about best practices for enforcing these standards since then. So there's a ton of opportunity to pick and choose what's worked for other communities and adopt a few other higher standards. I guess full disclosure, one apparent omission in the Minnesota rules is that it doesn't allow for the removal of dead trees or invasives. There's also nothing in rule that requires restoration when it's documented that a violation has occurred. So that's a really good opportunity for higher standards. You know, vegetation standards are just much easier to regulate when the ordinance is crystal clear about what's allowed and what the correction would be when a violation occurs. Lakeland codified some higher standards in their this was before my time, but I heard that it was a really big effort and some good ideas came out of it. I was looking at the Lakeland ordinance just a few weeks ago. And I'm in the process of developing a few recommended higher standards that I hope to put on our website. And I would expect a lot of this guidance would be based on some items found in the Lakeland ordinance. So if you're a zoning administrator and you get to the point of laying out conditions for a permit, which would guide design of vegetation restoration, we'd suggest being very clear in the type of vegetation, the width, the depth, you know, other specifics that would guide that restoration. And as mentioned in the last slide, there's nothing in the rules or ordinances that provide specifics on when it may be appropriate to require plant restorations, at least on the Minnesota side of the river. And if your ordinance mirrors what's in the rules, you may only have that opportunity when applying conditions for a CUP or a variance. But I mean, you know, you can think of other times when restoration would be appropriate. You know, I mentioned 2 weeks ago that with the high water that we've had, there's about to be a whole lot of dead trees in floodplain areas. That high water was sustained, and you know, there's about to be a fair amount of turnover in that near shore area. So as a result, we're going to see a lot more erosion, and communities should consider the permit activities that would come of that, and how their ordinance addresses removal of those dead trees, and if there's any guidance, clear guidance for replacement. And some really good ideas came from the recent rulemaking we had for the Mississippi River Corridor Critical Area. We call it the MRCA, which shares a boundary with the National Park Service's Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, or MINRA. A big focus of this rulemaking was preservation of views, similar to the Lower St. Croix, and vegetation, but it's regulated very differently. So there, for that rulemaking, there was a good amount of stakeholder involvement. What works, what doesn't, from a zoning administrator standpoint. And, you know, I think that we're just in a much better position to recommend best practices for preserving and restoring vegetation. You know, so we're there to help for a community that wants to do more. Real quick slide, because I touched on monitoring 2 weeks ago, but you know, it's good to think about how you're monitoring the vegetation that is being cleared. We recognize that the majority of communities are enforcing removals on a complaint basis, and I'm not necessarily advocating for a more proactive approach, because, you know, I know what kind of staff time that would require, but a community, when faced with a violation, it helps to have some kind of baseline data to prove the fact that a violation has taken place. So this picture came from Washington County's property map viewer, and these are 2017 aerials and pretty good quality. You know, you can actually zoom in and see individual trees and would be able to see very clearly if one were removed. And then another method of monitoring would be shoreland pics. The majority of communities along the Riverway are very small and only have a limited amount of shoreline. So it wouldn't be that hard to, I guess, theoretically just get in a boat and take some pictures of your shore. All right, Kay, this is you.
Okay. So we also have vegetation management goals within each of our 5 management zones. And to kind of just provide a general overview is that vegetation within the ordinary high watermark setback, the bluff setback, and the slope preservation zone shall be left undisturbed. And of course, we want to make sure that, you know, these steep slopes and bluff top areas and environmentally sensitive areas are left intact to really prevent disturbance and erosion. As you all know, we are having incredibly high water on our coastal Great Lakes, and we have a variety of structures on the Lake Michigan side that have actually fallen off the bluff into the lake because of, well, the coastal storms, the intensity, but also people are so intent on having a view and removing vegetation from their steep slopes that it increases failure. So, you know, the same within the Riverway area, we have some incredibly steep slopes and we want that vegetation to not be disturbed and removed. It also helps, obviously, hide the structure. And we have also some allowances that if there's some lawns within that area, they can be maintained, but they cannot be enlarged. And we do have a provision that allows for the removal of non-native invasive species. And if you have something essentially that's dead and dying, that it can be removed, but it has to be replaced with native species. And coming from a zoning administrator standpoint, vegetation removal is incredibly challenging to regulate, and especially when these come in on a complaint basis. If anybody needs any help out there with regard to like how do you get at it, I'm more than happy to help walk some communities through kind of the challenge of providing the information and evidence that you need. I've worked on many of them over my time. We also have an additional standard within the small town historic management zone. And I thought this was really interesting and hadn't spent a lot of time on this one. It had not really ever come up, but if there's fewer than 25 trees over 5 inch with a diameter base height from the building line in the river, they all have to be maintained. So just kind of some interesting differences, but I agree with Matt. These are challenging, and if communities can make their vegetation standards clear so people can understand them and that you can actually regulate the removal, it is very, very helpful.
Thanks, Kay. I think that just about all these standards, like as Kay's introducing them, basically all of these standards would also work on the Minnesota side of the river. So for those communities that get inspired by something that Kay's introducing, it's something that I would definitely be interested in exploring more.
Hey, Matt, there's a couple of questions related to view sheds and vegetation management before you go on to this next topic.
Yeah.
One, are solar roof installations allowed? Do you know if there's any?
There's no language on solar, just because it was a technology that never existed when the rules were written, and there's nothing explicitly prohibiting it either. And I would imagine that it would be treated as any appurtenance. The rules regulate appurtenances. So a deck is an appurtenance. A patio is as well. A stairway is an appurtenance. And I would think that a solar structure, especially if attached to a house, would be an appurtenance as well. So that would also be subject to the same height and setback standards.
Okay. I would also agree. We have actually some glazing standards that the glass has to be non-reflective. So I would today, I mean, our solar is pretty much non-reflective, but I know back in the day, there could be, you know, if you were out in the boat taking a look, you're like, oh, wow, look at the whole solar panels on the roof. So I would just say for the Wisconsin side, it is also allowed, but we would want to make sure that it's just non-reflective, like the panels.
Okay.
And that's an interesting one. I had never heard of a non-reflective glazing standard, but I just wrote that down for our ideas for higher standards.
Two questions related to vegetation. One, the watershed districts, which exist in Minnesota, is there a role for them to play in terms of vegetation management? Or is that covered by the state and local community rules? And the other question is about emerald ash borer. And, you know, a lot of communities are proactively taking down the elms, you know, or the ash. Is that something, you know, how are we grappling with that issue along the Riverway?
Yeah, those are both good questions. So I'll take those individually. And the first one mentioned, you mentioned watershed district rules. Those watershed district rules are higher standards above and beyond what a given project is subject to under the local communities ordinance. There are certain things that might trigger compliance with watershed district rules as well. And I think there's differences between community and between watershed districts and how those are codified. Some watershed district rules are codified within a local community's ordinance. So a local community's ordinance is just complying with what the rules are within the watershed district. Mm-hmm. And then some watershed districts for certain activities have their own permitting as well. And and those would always go above and beyond what's enforced at the local level. So, I mean, different watershed districts have different priorities. Some watersheds storage is a really big deal where you have flooding, and other watershed districts are dealing with significant erosion and you know, very channelized, unstable streams, and they might prioritize restoration projects more. So, you know, it's great that we're promoting more watershed level planning. And then what was the second question again? Oh yeah,
Oh, Emerald Ash
Emerald ash borer. Yeah. So that's a really big issue, because some plant communities are really heavily comprised of emerald ash borer, and you know, it's going to be every bit as impactful as Dutch elm disease back in the 70s or 60s or whenever that was. You know, huge plant communities are going to die, and it's already starting up here. And the first species to take their place is going to be the most aggressive ones, and here it's buckthorn and honeysuckle, and you know, it's growing heavy all up and down the Riverway and all over really the Midwest. So you know, it's good for communities to be thinking about how we want to be promoting restorations, because people want to cut down you know, their dead ash trees, and you know, what goes in its place, and it's important to get good stuff established. Okay, so with that, I'll move on. Grading and filling. On the Minnesota side, really a local permit is required anytime you're changing the grade. So there's no alterations on bluffs where erosion may result. And you know, keep any disturbances to a minimum really anywhere. And we want to stabilize that ground as soon as possible. So the rules promote restoration and ground cover, but they call out sod specifically as an example for permanent ground cover. You know, and there's better stuff that we can be planting besides sod. And so as I continue to push for more protective standards, one good higher standard would be for a community to simply change the wording of their ordinance and instead promote restoration of deep-rooted woody vegetation as opposed to sod. In the Merker rules, we use the term vegetation with a high stem density along shore, which would be like willows or something else that's going to hold that soil. And this next slide is Kay's.
And we also have filling and grading standards, which they're kind of split into, like, so if you would be wanting to do some filling and grading and you are outside of the slope preservation zone by at least 40 feet, then you may do filling and grading activities as long as you don't disturb more than 10,000 square feet of land, and of course you haven't impacted any wetlands. Any vegetation that is removed during this activity has to be replanted with native vegetation, and of course BMPs are necessary as well to regulate and minimize erosion and sedimentation. Then what happens is, if you are within the slope preservation zone, you can do some filling and grading with a conditional use permit, which requires a public hearing, as long as that area doesn't face or drain to the river, and it has to be outside of the slope preservation zone though when it's greater than 10,000 square feet. So a little bit of differences and a little bit, you know, thankfully stricter controls with regard to when you are in the slope preservation zone.
Okay. The next standard I'm going to talk about is one that's given a lot of communities challenges, and that's related to substandard lots. And a good chunk of the southern part of the Riverway has already been fully subdivided, especially in those urban areas. And there's a handful of lots that were split before these rules were put in place, and these lots don't meet the lot size or lot width standards in rule. And the rules have specific language that details when these lots are considered buildable. And for a substandard lot to be buildable, it must be able to accommodate a legal septic system. It must have been in separate ownership from adjoining lots. And the ordinance may also set minimum size criteria for what they consider buildable. Washington County's ordinance requires lots to be at least 60%. So they've specified a number, a percentage. Lots must be at least 60% of the minimum lot size before they're buildable. And the rules allow some reasonable customization of this provision by community to accommodate for the types of non-conforming lots that may exist. So the rules require setbacks to be met to the greatest extent practicable. Washington County's ordinance requires that these setbacks are met, period, for non-conforming lots. And they also require the lot to be on a maintained road. Chisago County explicitly prohibits variances along, they allow for the construction of a structure which would be visible from the river. So if there's a proposal for a variance and that structure would be visible from the river, and that structure is on a non-conforming lot, they've written it into their ordinance that that's a variance that they can't approve. It's a really good standard. All right, this is your slide, Kay.
So we have also some substandard lots of record language, and without going into too great of detail, you probably heard of the Murr case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that was with regard to whether or not the lot was actually combined and merged together. And if anybody wants to talk about that, they can call me later for that, but that was actually a pretty big win with regard to governments and environmental aspects of lots and substandard lots. However, we saw some legislative language and changes come after that. So kind of a 10-year process in the making, but essentially, and I just kind of rambled there, but our substandard lots that have been a lot of record, which means they were legally created in the first place, as of January of '76, can be buildable if they have been in separate ownership, if the structure complies, and if there's at least 1 acre of net project area. So those are essentially the 3 criteria that we use with regard to substandard lots of record.
Okay. And we also have the term substandard structures. And those are structures that were built before 1974 that don't meet today's standards. And they're basically grandfathered as is. Many of these older structures, they more often than not resemble small cabins. And, to be honest, these lots were are a lot more valuable now than they were 50 years ago. And there's a strong push to develop them as intensively as possible. And there's a fair amount of confusion regarding these provisions because they're different than what applies to non-conforming structures. And those non-conforming structure language, that's written in statute. Substandard structures are a type of nonconformity, but they're treated differently in the lower St. Croix. That's generated some confusion. But I mean, basically, there's two things that folks want to do with these structures: expand them or replace them with something bigger. And expansions are allowed, and these regulations are actually more lenient than that in the nonconformity statute, which guides expansions in other shoreland areas around the state, or just zoning in general. However, you can't increase the extent by which the structure is substandard. So if the structure is too close to the water, you can't build it closer. If it's too tall, you can't build it higher. So whether you're building it up or sideways, it's really only allowed if it's, quote, visually inconspicuous. This actually gives an incentive for owners of non-conforming structures to keep their shoreline densely vegetated. You know, if you can't see the expansion because vegetation is in the way, it's allowed. If you can see it, it's not allowed. So, you know, if you're the owner of a non-conforming structure and you have plans to expand it, I would suggest start planting. Then there's also standards for replacements, and replacement restrictions are stricter than non-conforming statutes. They're simply not allowed. And some folks like to assume reconstruction is allowed if they build within the existing foundation, or if they rebuild slightly further away, just no bigger. But actually, any replacement, and rules are very clear, any replacement must meet the setback and height restrictions as if it were a new structure. So a common complaint is the term replacement is often manipulated. And this development here was discussed by the Lower St. Croix River Partnership team. And here we see a house that was leveled with a couple of walls remaining. And, you know, a much larger structure was built in its place within the existing foundation. And, you know, the partnership team looked into a little bit, and the permit was processed simply as maintenance. Okay. And I guess two easy ways to address these situations. If you're a community that cares about the regulations anyway, one way is just to clarify what replacement is by defining it. And that's an omission in the rules, full disclosure. Another would be similar to what Washington County does. And what they do is they prohibit replacement if the homeowner wishes to tear down the majority of the structure. And you know, so if they tear down more than 50% of the appraised value. And this is basically the same idea, it's just referenced in a different part of the ordinance. So again, there's a lot of property owners that wish to expand their structure as much as possible. And this is a hot topic in the Riverway. It results in neighbor conflicts, and zoning administrators hate to deal with it because they don't want to be the one that has to give bad news. Washington County, they choose to prohibit vertical expansions when the existing structure doesn't meet setbacks. And this is an excellent higher standard, and one that we would like to highlight more. They also limit expansions to no more than 50% of what you can see from the water. And this is another interesting standard. You know, so thereby, you know, basically incentivizing additions instead on the side facing away from the water. And Wisconsin rules, so Kay hasn't introduced it, but I just added this when I found Kay's slide. They only allow expansions if the lot is at least 7,000 square feet and visually inconspicuous. So this is their visually inconspicuous standard is consistent with our rules, and this is a really good provision.
Yeah, and
So
I saw a question come in down below. Somebody was asking, well, what does that mean, visually inconspicuous at what time of year? And in our code, it's written as in summer months, that you wouldn't be able to see the
yeah,
structure
yeah, yeah,
with leaf on. So just to clarify that for that question that they wrote in.
yeah. Some summer months leaf on is exactly how we have it written. So my guess is that that probably dates back to the master plan.
Yeah.
But I guess long story short, if you want a big house, you need a big lot to accommodate it. All right, Kay.
So yeah, so we regulate non-conforming structures, and a non-conforming structure is one that was legally constructed at the time but doesn't meet one of the ordinance regulations today. So maybe ordinary high watermark setback, bluff setback, etc. And for the Wisconsin side, non-conforming principal structures, you can do ordinary maintenance and repair. That's allowed in all of the management zone, but you can only do a structural alteration or a reconstruction, like Matt said, is if the lot has at least 7,000 square feet, it's visually inconspicuous, it's in the same footprint, the height complies with code, or it's not any taller than it currently is. There is some allowance, obviously, to replace a flat roof with a pitched roof. The color needs to comply with earth colored tones, and also that the sanitary system is brought into compliance. The foundation, though, may not be replaced, improved, or structurally modified unless it's being done in conjunction with the reconstruction of a structure which is greater than 50 feet from the ordinary high and not located in a slope preservation zone. Filling and grading has to be minimal for what just really is necessary in order to get the job done. And then I think I think there might be one more slide that has some interesting things on these. Yeah, so again, I didn't list all of the provisions, but really the key takeaway is that there's no expansion for structures that are wholly or partially within 50 feet of the ordinary high or partially located within the slope preservation zone. If the structure is within the ordinary high watermark, it may not exceed 1,500 square feet of floor area. So, you know, back in the day when the ordinance was adopted, that was probably a very modest square footage. Today, we know that structures that are being constructed are anywhere from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 square feet. So for some people, this is quite small. If it's located within the bluff setback, but not the ordinary high, the structure can't exceed 2,000 square feet, and it has to use, of course, earth tone materials as well. Expansion has to be on the farthest side from the river, and mitigation is required for all of these expansions as well. So just kind of some interesting differences. And I think, you noted, Matt, that you guys regulate impervious surfaces. We regulate impervious surface ratios through shoreland zoning, but we don't really have anything specifically within NR 118, but we get at some of that with regard to like footprint and floor area of structure. So
yeah, and I really like these provisions too, and this accommodates for differences between the lot and differences between non-conforming structures, because if you're subject to a 200-foot setback and the structure is 190 feet away, like that's non-conforming and it's subject to the non-conforming structure provisions, but it's certainly not as impactful as one that's within 50 feet of the ordinary high water level.
Right. Yeah, so that's really clear that there just is no expansion for a structure that's wholly or partially within 50 feet of the ordinary high.
Yeah, these are great standards. So I'm going to close this presentation. I got 4 more slides, and they all deal with higher standards, recommended higher standards. you know, and it's just basically a grab bag of different examples. But the first one I'll share is another full disclosure of an omission in rules. There is no definition for what an impervious surface is. The limit is 20% in any given lot, so you can't exceed 20% impervious surfaces on your lot. But it doesn't specifically identify decks. You know, people are confused about decks because decks have openings. I've heard some people consider gravel driveways an impervious surface, or consider them a pervious surface. I've even come across one example of a community requiring a property owner to convert their paved driveway into a gravel driveway to meet that standard, and that's just not the intent. A gravel driveway is impervious. Permeable pavers didn't exist when the rules were written in 1974. So an easy higher standard that which we'd encourage every community in Minnesota to take advantage of is just to simply define what it is. And the example on the screen comes from Otter Tail County, but there's examples all over the state that are just as good. The Riverway rules have no special standards for placement of riprap. However, it requires a local permit. And if those activities are below the ordinary high water, a DNR permit and a core permit as well. Riprap should only be used to fix an established erosion problem. And all too often we see a line of boulders along the shore for aesthetic purposes. And, you know, I spoke about this 2 weeks ago, and this isn't riprap. And this typically isn't solving the erosion problem at all. And in fact, to lay that, you're disturbing a fair amount of soil. So here, this standard comes from both Beltrami and Cass counties. I don't know who came up with it first, but it requires vegetation to be incorporated into a riprap project. So it requires a 10-foot vegetation buffer to parallel the backside of that riprap. And this helps to hold that soil in place, and it's an excellent standard. And then the last two that I'll share relate to flood protection, and there's a fair amount of flood prone structures in the Riverway. And this one relates to elevating a structure, whether it's a new home or a structure that is being lifted on its existing foundation. It's important to recognize that there's the two primary ways to elevate a house in the flood fringe. The traditional method is to do so on fill, like you see in this picture here. In the Riverway, we're slightly more vegetated than this, but you get the idea. And then the other way is to utilize what we call alternative elevation methods. And that's typically where a structure is elevated on its existing foundation, and the ground floor is just utilized for storage or parking, or sometimes it's just filled around a elevated foundation or stem wall. So if you're elevating like the way on the left, you can't apply fill without destroying the vegetation that was there originally. So elevating in this manner would result, or I guess elevating in the manner on the way on the right, you would have a smaller development footprint, especially if you're elevating a significant distance, and would probably be the preferred method of elevation in the river valley. A community could easily limit elevations of this type by designing, just by writing it into their ordinance. And I guess to take it a step further, if you look at the vegetation standards, it could be argued that this is actually the only way a structure should be elevated, because the vegetation standards say that clearing should be the minimum necessary to build a structure. So, you know, if you have a structure and you got to elevate 10 feet to get above that 100-year flood elevation, you're clearing a ton of vegetation. So, you know, a zoning administrator should be thinking of these as tools to address those types of situations. And every zoning administrator has different flooding issues in their community, and it's different everywhere you go. So in addition to the extensive clearing required when elevating on fill, construction on fill also presents issues with the height standard. And in this example, I guess let's pretend ground level is like natural ground anyways, is 10 feet below this, below the 100-year flood elevation. And to build our structure, we're gonna add 11 feet of fill and then construct a building 35 feet above that, because that's our height limitation. So we've just created a 45-foot structure that exceeds the intent of the rule. And the height standard in rule says that it's measured from the average ground level at the building setback line. And most communities have left this definition out of their Riverway ordinance and instead just rely on their own height definition elsewhere in their local zoning ordinance. But one addition that you can do is just say that, I guess, if a community has some very low areas, you know, you may want to just change your definition for height to be measured from the average natural ground level. So that's really all I got, and I put this slide together before I knew Kay was joining me. So I don't know if Kay, do you want to share your contact information?
Sure, and if anybody does have questions, they can either reach Angela or Matt to get my contact information if you can't write it down. But if you need anything from me, my email is kay.lutze@wisconsin.gov, and Wisconsin is spelled out. So k.lutze@wisconsin.gov.
Excellent. Matt, Kay, thank you so much for this presentation. For those of you that are still watching, if you have questions and you want to go ahead and turn on your microphone to ask the question yourself, I think that we could take time to do that. If you want to type a question in the chat box, I know we fielded quite a few during the presentations. I will send out a link with the recording and contact information for both Matt and Kay sometime tomorrow, so you should be able to access that later on also. We have any further questions for our presenters?
Well, for those leaving, thank you.
Yes.
This is Craig Leiser, and I represent Browns Creek Watershed District. When I asked that earlier question about a watershed district, that was one of the reasons for it. And it's obvious that we have federal standards, state standards, city or community standards and or county standards. And then we layer on top of that watershed districts who should be primarily concerned with water levels, water flowing, water quantity, water quality. But it does get us to invasive species. It does get us to trees. It does get us to what happens with flood elevations that go up and down and kill the trees when they go up. Can you take them down when you're down, etc. So it's good to know that we have somebody at the state level who at least is qualified to be an adjudicator when we come against the insoluble question.
I do what I can. Thank you, Craig.
That's about all any of us do.
Yeah, some comments are a little tougher to make than others, but I try to be as impartial as possible.
Well, it's nice to know that somebody at least has experience in dealing with multiple rules.
Mm-hmm. Okay, are there any other questions from people in the group? we can keep the Zoom up for a couple more minutes if anybody wants to stay on to ask Kay or Matt a question. And for the rest of you, thank you so much for joining us. I know that a lot of you tuned in for all 3 of the Zoom workshops. I look forward to the day when we can all get on a boat and go out on the river together again and enjoy the beautiful day that we're having.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.